Yurugu comes from Dogon mythology. Small group of African people whom Europeans would consider probably primitive, unquote, who have a most complex cosmology. And in it, they talk about Ama, the creator, having created all beings with twin souls, the male and female part, and that represents the whole being. Yurugu was a being that tore himself away from the process of gestation, the process of being born, so to speak, early, before Ama was finished creating him. Because he wanted, in his arrogance, he wanted to compete with the Creator, with Ama, and create a better universe, an Earth, actually, than Ama could create. When he came down from the heavens, came to begin the process of creation, he found that everything that he created was incomplete. That indeed he could not create perfection or anything with life because he himself was incomplete. Mm-hmm. He then realized that he was missing a part of himself. So he goes back to Ama to get his female part so that he could be whole. Ama had given that twin soul, that female part, away. So that Yurugu was in the state of searching for this other part of himself that would make him whole and never being able to find it. So that he was forever incomplete, could only create destruction, actually, could only destroy, and could never be fulfilled. That to me was a statement of what I saw in the nature of European cultural thought and behavior.
Why is this study important? Why did you undertake this study?
There's a personal reason. At the point that I was at when I began graduate studies, I saw us as African people always being put into a position when we would be in European or white academic institutions of being used to study our communities so that they can then use the information to control us.
In her notable Yurugu lecture, Dr. Marimba begins by explaining the origins and meaning of the term Yurugu. Drawn from the cosmology of the Dogon people of Mali, Yurugu was a being who tore himself away from the divine process of birth before creation was complete. In his attempt to compete with the Creator, Yurugu entered the world as an incomplete entity, lacking the complementary feminine principle necessary for balanced creation. Because he was incomplete, he could not create life, but instead produced only destruction, disorder, and disharmony. Dr. Ani uses Yurugu as a metaphor to describe the character of European culture, a culture that projects power, conquest, and destruction because of its fundamental imbalance. From this foundation, Dr. Ani stresses that African people have not truly studied the European mentality. She emphasizes that we often assume we already understand our enemy, but in reality, we have not taken time to deeply analyze European cultural behavior, psychological patterns, and historical motivations. Her work, she emphasizes, is part of the effort to unmask the European worldview and expose its underlying drive. Through her study, Dr. Ani concludes that European culture possesses a thirst for total conquest, an unending belief that the Europeans should rule all people, all spaces, and all dimensions of the universe.
So that I would not be put into that position, and decided that as I was being taught European anthropology, I said, let me use some of this and see if I can turn it around and indeed study them and put them under the microscope. And that was the beginning of this process. I think the ideological reason, the political reason, most definitely was that Europeans have been very good at masking their intentions and their posture towards African people and other non-European people. And we have not understood what their purposes are, their intent towards us, have not understood their behavior. And I felt that this kind of study could help to unmask what in reality is the nature of Europeans.
So Urugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior, is about what?
It's about how European culture works as a consistent machine for the achievement of European power and total control of the universe. That's what it's about.
Let some people think that this study is just for, or book is just for intellectuals and not for the working man and woman. Could you tell us some ways that European cultural thought and behavior have us working against ourselves?
One of the things that they do, I think, that is very damaging is the way in which they, how shall I put it, train our children in schools to act against themselves and their people, to deny the aspects of themselves that really indeed are their strengths. We, of course, have experienced that, have been conditioned in this way, and it affects every single one of us. What you call the working Africans may be in a better position to begin to understand the kinds of things that I'm pointing to. It is the people who have been so indoctrinated within the academies that find it more difficult to critique, to look critically. Because the Academy, since the time of Plato, back in 600, 700, 500 actually, years before the Common Era, the Academy is the place that has been used to despiritualize the universe, has been used to promote a conception of truth that has no spirit in it. And we as an African people are a spiritual people. So that what it does is, these institutions do, is to take us away from ourselves. So the more time you spend in them, the more you are convinced that of this European reality, which is not a real reality, is not a reality for African people.
You make this statement in your introduction. This study was not approached objectively. It is not possible to be objective towards Europe. Explain that.
The concept of objectivity itself is something that has been used by Europeans to control African people. It is a concept which says that we can contemplate truth without being connected to any culture, without coming from any perspective, without having any political implications in what we do. That, of course, is not the case. And what we did was to accept this and say that, oh, they're scientists, they're scholars, and so forth, were describing us objectively. What they were doing was promoting a particular way of viewing the world, promoting a particular political interest in the world. I do not make that claim because that claim, it would be a lie. And it is always a lie When, you open up a book and somebody says, well, I'm being objective in doing this. How can you be objective? You are a human being. You're part of a culture. Your people have had an historical relationship to other people. For any African person to say that they are being objective about Europe would be to say that they were being apolitical, non-political. We need to get away from that. So this is a very political work. It is meant to be.
If you told black people that white people were committing biological genocide against us and that by the year 2000, whatever, there would be no more black people, you would get one reaction. But you're saying that we're being threatened with cultural and psychological extinction. How do you get African people to see the urgency of this situation?
I don't know, frankly, if you can. I think that we have to focus on young people, young African people who have not been so conditioned with a way of thinking that supports European imperialism, European power, that they still have the ability to use their intuition, their spirituality, their Africanness to create, to think beyond the limitations that have been given to them in European academies. I think most of us as adults, as elders, have been so conditioned that we're afraid to move beyond the parameters that have been defined by our enemies in our thinking, so that our vision is limited. And so we are really not the people who should be conceptualizing the plans, the movements, what we should be building. But I focus on the younger people who hopefully are still more in touch with what is natural to African people. And if I can affirm that in them, they will see the urgency. I find that in my teaching. I find that in teaching young people, that once they are affirmed and introduced in a conscious way to the African worldview, it becomes crystal clear to them. And they see an urgency in us as African people building for self, as opposed to imitating forms which have been put in place to make sure that we continue to be oppressed.
Culturally and psychologically, do you think we realize what we have lost?
No, not. It's ironic because we don't realize it on a conscious level. Yet we live it every day. In the way we walk, in the way we talk, in the way in the music we create. There is a depth of spirituality which exists in us as a people, which has continued since our origins, that our ancestors have passed to us, and which we continue to pass on ourselves, that we don't consciously recognize as a strength. We don't realize that it is something that we need to use to think with, so that when we are presented with a European worldview in the classroom, we think that that's the only way to be. That's the only way to think, because we didn't come with anything. So I don't think that we are aware on a conscious level of what it is that we've moved away from in terms of power. You see, that's what we're not aware of.
Could you talk some about how we came to be who and what we are today? If you understand the question.
I think I do.
Okay.
I think that we have to look back at a period that I call the Ma'afa. We as Africans were very consciously stripped of our culture. Now, that becomes a platitude. You know, everybody's saying that. Stripped of our culture, but we have to see that we had a strong culture and so forth. But nobody seems to realize the depth of what that means. Being stripped of our culture meant being conditioned to accept ourselves as inferior beings. Okay? It meant that we were conditioned to feel that we had to be dependent on Europeans, dependent on white people, that we could not do things for ourselves and in our own image. That conditioning began with a long period of terrorism, which was very physical, physically manifested. At the same time, there was the breaking of the will. So there was cultural violence, I call it, in the book, as well as the physical violence, which was very important. We then came to a period in which we mistakenly thought we were free. We're now at a point where we think that we have freedom, the ability to be whatever it is that we can be within this society and so forth. Yet what happens is that we are still thinking within a modality that has been determined by those who would oppress us, those who would control us. And we don't see beyond that. So the question for me becomes, who controls how you think? We have the ability to create our own structures, our own theories, our own definitions of reality. To look at the African worldview, to look at, for instance, the Dogon people, to look at the Kemetic people, to look at our own people who have, even look at Carter G. Woodson, for instance, the miseducation of the Negro, which I don't think was really ever understood by us, and to use these things as inspirations for the building of institutions, the creation of things, the building our own buildings. We have the ability to do that. So it's almost like we've been conditioned so well through such a long process that now it is us who are enslaving ourselves mentally.
Because the job has already been...
The job has been done. It would be so easy, in one sense, for us to undo it. That's what I'm saying in this book. Because the way the system of European control works is that you have to accept a concept of reality which makes them superior. If you deny that, their thing will not work, and they will lose their control. So that they put all of this energy into establishing the system that begins when you're 3, 4, and so forth, which defines reality in such a way where there's no spirit, because they aren't a spiritual people, you see, which talks about this objective truth and so forth, which says that African spirituality represents backwardness, so you need to move away from it. It does all of these things which make you as an African person, me as an African person, us distrust the very part of ourselves which is our strength.
I'm going to get back to this question, and that is this whole question of, do we know what we have lost? Do we realize that we have not always been Democrats, have not always been Baptists, have not always been black Greeks, have not always been links, have not always. How do we conceive of ourselves in a different time?
I think that there is a lot that is being done within the movement of African-centered education in that regard. In terms of, I think we have more information now that we've ever had before. And I have seen the effect of that information. That is very important, that people do begin to realize and understand, first of all, how young Europe is in relationship to Africa, and what we were putting into place, creating, building, conceiving of long before Europe existed. When you open people's minds to that, it can have a lot of power. So that I think that generally we have not understood that, but we have an opportunity to do so because of the work of many people now that is building on work that was done before that we didn't know about.
Good evening and welcome to For the People and the second part of our conversation with Dr. Donna M. Richards, author of Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. In this segment, Dr. Richards discusses, among other things, the role the Greek philosopher Plato played in creating the European way of thinking and behaving. But first, we begin with this question. As you say, other cultures have exhibited aggression, imperialistic tendencies. What accounts for Europe's success?
I'm glad you got to that question. Because what it allows me to do, I think, is to get at what I think is the specialness of the approach, the method that I used in this study. So it's going to take me a little while, if that's okay. I said to myself that, and this definitely was with the help of the ancestors. I want to, affirm that, by the way, that it was not...
Why is that important?
That's important because of our concept of connectedness, our concept of the universe, that it's not just words to talk of a spiritual universe and our spirituality as a people, but we've got to understand where our energy comes from. And I know that that's where mine came from. So this is ours. This belongs to us. I had to say, how would I approach studying the European given African conceptions? You see, it's one thing to say, okay, I want to do this, but then use their conceptions. What does it mean for us to really think in African terms? And so what I did was to develop concepts that came from an African worldview, not a European worldview. And I came up with the concept of asili. I also used African language. That's a Kiswahili word that means seed, origin, the essence of something. The reason that was important was because what people would say is, and they will say, oh, Europe is so vast. It is, there's so many different kinds of European forms and different countries. How can you talk about Europe as a whole? Now, of course, they've been talking about Europe as a whole all of this time, but when we begin to look at them, suddenly it's going to be, no, you can't really do this because it's too diverse. I needed a concept which could explain a culture in terms of its core, in terms of its ideological core, so that you could look at every different aspect of the culture and see how it fit into this one seed or core. And that's why I used the asili. And the idea of the seed was that once that asili is in place, that cultural asili, that it will seek to fulfill itself. So the way in which the culture will develop will all be feeding into that asili. And that would help me to get at consistency in terms of European development. What throws us as a people is that we make exceptions. You know, we say, oh, well, that's different over here, and that's different. This is a good one over here, and this doesn't really work that way. But in my analysis, it's all consistent, and it's all working for one purpose. And the concept of asili helped me to see that. And that comes to the answer to your question, is that what I was able to do was to see that the nature of the European asili was to seek power. That it, in essence, is, we could almost say it is an asili which lacks wholeness, and therefore must always see. Go back to Yurugu now. Remember Yurugu as the incomplete being that is always must be seeking, but can never be fulfilled because he can't get the complementary part of himself. Their asili, the European cultural asili, is incomplete. Must always be seeking. Now, it cannot be fulfilled through spirit because they have no knowledge of spirit, no relationship to spiritual reality. Therefore, fulfillment is sought through power. And power here means power over other. And what that means is that everything within the culture, all of the development of European culture, all of the forms, all of the institutions, the ideas even, are all for the purpose of achieving European power. Now, your question was, if we can recognize that there have been imperialistic behaviors in other cultures, then what is the difference between European culture and these other cultures? And the answer is that Europeans have been most successful at achieving world domination because everything within the culture supports the quest for domination.
Everything.
Everything. Including, and most importantly to me, their philosophical concepts, including their concept of truth, including their academies, academia, the intellectuals, including that. It works, including Christianity as it manifests itself, within the European development. All of that works for the achievement of European power.
Okay. What would you say are the main features of African cultural thought and behavior that separate it from European cultural thought and behavior?
I think that that's a good question, because even to understand the nature of European culture and how it works, what we need to begin with is the African worldview and how it works. That provides a frame of reference that you can then use. The African concept of the universe is as a spiritual whole, where everything is interrelated. That means that what is emphasized is not only spirit, but connectedness. And that we conceive of ourselves, we experience ourselves, I should say, as spiritual beings, that almost as cosmic beings. And by that I mean that we are connected to nature, to the forces of nature, to each other, in such a way that that's where we get definition and that's where we get strength. And so power for us becomes energy, the energy to do, to make things happen. We energize each other. Interaction becomes important. Complementarity becomes important. The relationship between spirit and matter is one in which they are connected, where material reality is understood as just the way spirit manifests itself. That simply. On the other hand, in the European worldview, and way of thinking, way of looking at the universe. Human beings become separate and distinct individuals. The only way that you can know anything about the universe is to separate yourself from it, to take connectedness out of it, and thereby create what they call the object. That's all that you can know. Now, this object is a thing that has no feeling, no meaning, no spirit. Okay? That's an illusion in their minds. But it works for them, because if they what Plato did, if we can go back to Plato, is that if he could get people to agree that this was the only truth, then what he could do is say that, well, the people who were closest to that truth, those are the people who should rule all the other people. So that worked within their culture. It gave him the basis for a hierarchy within Europe.
Now explain to me this creation of the object thing. I'm not clear on that.
Okay, what you do is, if you can, as a human being, first separate, make a split in yourself and say, there's part of me that thinks and there's part of me that feels. Now, in reality, that doesn't happen. You're a whole person. At least that's the African conception. But in his conception, that's what he said. That's what Plato said. Then what you say is, there's a part of me that's better than the other part of me. This thinking part is better than this other part. Okay? Then you say that the better part needs to either control or do away with that lesser part. So you got this thinking being.
This emotional part, or what?
The thinking part is getting rid of the emotional part.
Right.
Okay? Trying to control that. And so then what he says is, that's the only way that you can have knowledge.
A major part of this domination, Dr. Ani argues, operates through the European-controlled school system. These institutions do not exist to empower African children. Rather, they condition black youth to work against their own interest. Schools under European control train black children to support the system of white supremacy instead of nurturing loyalty, identity, or commitment to their own people. Dr. Ani stresses that an oppressor will never design an educational system that liberates those they dominate. The longer African people remain immersed in European institutions, she warns, the more deeply our minds become whitewashed, shaped to reflect European values and worldviews instead of our own. Dr. Ani further explains that propaganda and cultural manipulation are central to European domination. Europeans have long controlled narratives, images, and historical interpretations about black people, teaching us to internalize lies about who we are. As a result, many African-descended people unknowingly absorb a European worldview, grow detached from African cultural knowledge, and develop feelings of inferiority or self-hatred. This internalized oppression, Dr. Ani states, is one of the most powerful tools of white supremacy because it causes the oppressed to police themselves. In her conclusion, Dr. Ani urges African people to redirect their energy toward educating and training their own youth rather than relying on European institutions. True liberation begins with cultivating healthy, conscious, and culturally grounded children. She argues that if African communities empower their youth with knowledge of themselves, pride in their heritage, and tools for collective survival, they can secure a future rooted in strength and unity. The responsibility lies with the adults. We must discipline ourselves, improve ourselves, and model dignity so that our youth can grow into healthy black people capable of repairing and rebuilding their world.